All right. So what today's going to be is two-pronged. We have an exit ticket to do at the end of the class that is standalone. It's a little longer than normal, but not too much longer. But it will be open note, and we'll get into the exit ticket at the end of the class. We do have new material to cover, so you will need to be taking notes in a second, but it is not a lot of new material. It's very short. What I want to do for the first chunk of class is do a quick review, and I mean quick, where we're going to go over the war in the U.S., what it was like, and then we're going to talk about the war itself, and then we're going to go into all of the new stuff, the post-war stuff that we're going to talk about, and then that'll be it for Unit 7, and we'll talk about reviewing in the exam and all that stuff tomorrow. So that's what we're going to do. So let me share my screen. Like I said, this first part is all review, so you should not need any note taking, right? You should already have these notes. If you don't have them, well, I would reference these slides and try to get them in a little later. But first things first, I'm going to be asking you guys some questions. So Pearl Harbor, December 7th happened. What's the big deal? What is the effect of Pearl Harbor? What happens as a result? Yes, it's an attack. Yes, Americans die, but what's the result? Somebody in the chat tell me. You can send a private, public, doesn't matter. If you don't know, put don't know or put don't remember. I forgot. It's been a long week. I'm trying to get back into swing. Brings the U.S. into World War II, right? The U.S. joins the war. Awesome. So that's the effect of Pearl Harbor. The United States joins World War II. Economically speaking, in the United States, the war, I was going to say the World War II, the war is a boom to the economy. It saves the U.S. economy. It saves the U.S. from the Great Depression, right? It's what gets us out. War bonds, just the stamps, right? It's buy the stamp now, get more money for it later. Now, there's a couple of agencies, right, that we got to remember. The War Productions Board, which controlled industry. Office of War Information, which was like the propaganda office. Office of Censorship, which controlled information. Price Administration controlled things like rent and wages. And then ration books, the idea that supplies needed to be rationed by the people, whether it be food, gasoline, sugar, anything. Now, all of these agencies are very different. They have different jobs. Some of them are there to protect information. Some of them are there to keep people invested in the war. Some of them are there to make sure that the U.S. doesn't run out of supplies for fighting the war. But there's one thing that unites all of these federal agencies. There's one thing that is common throughout it. So I'm going to give you a minute and a half. I want you to try to tell me what it is. Do you remember what unites all of these agencies? And if you don't know and the minute comes up, just put I don't know. But I want to hear from all of you guys. Or I don't want to hear from everybody in the class right now. So a minute and a half on the clock. What unites all of these federal agencies? What unites them? What do they all have in common? What are they all doing? And again, if you don't remember, just put no clue, don't remember. I don't know. Okay. Seen a couple of don't remembers. Okay. No worries. By the way, guys, be honest. This is not like a gotcha moment. This is reviewing. It's been a long week. We've all been through a lot this week. We're trying to just get back on the track to where we were. It's a little refresher course, so to speak. About 40 seconds. Think about it. If you don't remember, you don't remember, but try to, what unites them? Try to think about it. Okay. About 10 seconds. All right, that's time. So I see a couple of good responses in here. There's a few don't remembers, which that's fine. I saw some about getting people invested in the war, getting civilians involved. That's good. It's a good guess. I saw another one that was like, hey, protecting information from spies, right? Well, so those things, the getting civilians involved, protecting information from spies, those are things that these individual groups did, right? Individual groups here did this, right? Like these guys are keeping people invested in the war. These people are protecting from information. These people are protecting from, loss of supplies. But what they all do and this is going to seem pretty bland, but it's not. They all increase the power of the federal government. Every single one of these agencies, they use the war to increase the power of the federal government. That's what's being done with these agencies. And it's important to note that. So if you forgot that, if it's in your old notes or if it's not written in your old notes somewhere, you might want to write it in. Right? These agencies all increase the power of the federal government. Now, really quickly, during the war, women are taking hold and getting more positions in the workforce, specifically in industrial jobs, agricultural jobs, doing jobs that they previously were not allowed to do or wouldn't be seen doing. And it's a really, it's a step forward. And of course, women in the armed forces, we talked about the WASPs and the WACs and the contributions they made, right? We talked about these ad nauseum, training pilots, flying planes back and forth across the nation, radios, running all of this stuff, right? And most of it was on the home front, and very few of them were sent abroad or in combat. Well, none of them were in combat, but their contributions to the military were significant. Like I said, one of the ones that I like to point out is the WASPs flying the B-17s and teaching younger, newer crews how to fly them as well. Helped a lot. The Bracero program. All right, so this is important. The Bracero program is a major milestone in not only U.S., but also Mexican-American history. And it's where Mexico and the United States agreed to allow Mexican laborers to come into the U.S. and work in their fields and in their agriculture system. It guaranteed things like housing and wages. Why does the United States need these new migrants to come into the U.S.? Why do they need these Mexican citizens to come in and work? Where are all the men that used to work in these fields? Somebody in the chat, tell me really quick. Where are all the men that used to work here? They're all fighting in the war, right? So because American people are fighting in the war, there's this gap, this space that needs to be filled, and that is in working in the fields, in the agriculture, keeping the food stocks up. So that's what the Bracero program is there for. For African Americans on the home front, the big thing to point out is the Double V campaign, right? Victory abroad against the Nazis, victory at home against segregation. Double V, it's really important. Segregation is still going strong. And the last thing I'll point out about what's going on at home is Japanese internment, right? We've talked about this, the executive order that interred more than 100,000 Japanese citizens. These are American citizens, I should say. I'm sorry, not Japanese citizens, Japanese Americans. Most of these people probably had never been to Japan, didn't have any ties to Japan. They were Americans, by and large. And a lot of them lost their property, homes, farm businesses, employment, things like that. And this was ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court in the case of Korematsu versus the United States. So goes to show you that, yeah, we're at war, a little dangerous, but still one of the not so great things the U.S. did, right? Which there's a few. That's definitely up there on the list for me. So again, interred American citizens. So this is all, and again, a big theme during this mobilization period, right, is federal power, federal government is increasing its power. So give me a second to adjust, and we're going to talk about the actual war itself. Again, this is all brief stuff. This is all stuff you should already have notes on. America's fighting a two-front war, right? They're fighting Japan in the Pacific and Germany in the Atlantic. The plan is the Germany first plan, right? Like, let's defeat Germany, then we'll all worry about Japan. That's the general thinking of it. For the phony war, not much, right? Just early on, there's no fighting. Like, everybody's just kind of pointing their guns at each other and waiting, but then the war starts. For total war, this is pretty important. Civilian populations in cities like London and Berlin are targets for bombing during this war. Civilians die in bombing all the time. It's not something that is avoided. It's not something that people see as wrong. It's something both sides are doing to try to end the war quicker. The Battle of Britain was a series of air battles that were between the British RAF and the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain is the reason why, the Battle of Britain is the reason why England or Britain is not invaded by Germany. The Nazis wanted to invade, but they could never get air superiority over the Channel. And because of that, they didn't invade. Britain stays standing as the last Allied power in the war until the U.S. will enter it later on. This is all in 1940. The first Americans that we send to England to fight Nazis are the B-17s and their crews. This is the air war over Europe. It starts in 41. It will go on throughout the entire war. In 41, Hitler, a little bored, can't take England because the RAF's in the way. So he invades the Soviet Union. Starts off well, but winter hits and it starts going bad, right? This is a big turning point in the conflict. Stalingrad is where the Germans lose the initiative. They lose their, I think it's like that whole army gets surrounded and destroyed, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of his other armies are going to have that too, because Barbarossa, he sends 3, but he doesn't let them consolidate. But yeah, some cool images. The only thing I'll point out about these 2 theaters is they're like practice invasions, right? Operation Torch, invasion of West Africa, kicked the Nazis out of Africa and Italy. Then, of course, the invasion of Italy, Avalanche. Some images from North Africa. Let's talk about the Western Front. Volume 2, right? Operation Overlord is the name of the D-Day invasions. D-Day is the actual day of the battles, famous ones, June 6, 1944. By August, Paris is liberated. In December of that year, 44, Germany takes their last punch, right? It's their last swing. It's their last offensive. Does not go well for Germany. They lose that battle eventually, and it's all downhill from there for them. The Russians and Americans will meet in April. By April 30th, Hitler will commit suicide, and soon after that, the war is over. For Germany, anyways. A couple of sets of images here. All right, so while that's going on, post-Pearl Harbor, right, we're going to focus on Germany first. The bulk of the U.S. in the Pacific, their whole job is to contain the Japanese. That's it. Just contain them, keep them away. And initially, that doesn't go well for them. From 41 all the way to 42, the Allies are losing in the Pacific. All these little islands, they're losing them. The Philippines will be lost. Bataan, Corregidor, horrible defeats for the Americans. Some of the worst American defeats in U.S. military history. Admiral Chester Nimitz will take control of the Pacific Fleet, which is recently repaired from Pearl Harbor, right? The ships that could be salvaged, including all their carriers, which is important. Then you get the battle at the Coral Sea. This is considered a major victory for the Allies, even though it's kind of a draw, but what it does, and the reason we claim it as a victory, is that it ends the Japanese expansion. So the Japanese no longer expand. They do not take the islands there, and they have to maintain the ones they have. Midway is a major victory and turning point for the war in the Pacific. The Japanese will lose all 4 of their aircraft carriers in one day. These are the same carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. This is the same veteran fleet that the Japanese have been using in all of these conflicts. Well, they lose it in one day at Midway. And that will change the tide of the war. From this point forward, Japan is on the defensive. And they have these little islands, and they're trying to defend them. That's all they can do now. Some images of the defeats, naval combat. I love this picture of the planes all flying around the carrier like bees. So once the Japanese fleet is destroyed, the Pacific theater the combat there is very different than it is in the Western Front. The strategy is known as island hopping. It's led by General Douglas MacArthur. The main idea is, hey, we'll take these one island at a time. If we see a Japanese island that's way too defended, we'll just skip it. We'll go to the next one, right? We'll just skip it and go to the next one. We'll punch a hole to Japan. And that's what they do. They put all their eggs in one basket. They throw one punch. They focus everything on one island at a time, jumping from island to island. The fighting is grueling. You know it's dangerous. A lot of people will die. But what the Americans and the Allies are noticing, Marines specifically, because they're always the ones that are first onto these islands, is that when the Japanese fight on these islands, they're fighting like to the last man and to the death. And a lot of the soldiers, when they've lost, are committing suicide. And on the islands where there's civilians, like Okinawa, the civilians are also committing suicide, like rather than being captured by the U.S. Marines. And the Marines don't really know why. And part of it is because there's propaganda out there that the Japanese put out, because the Japanese treated their enemies very cruelly. And the Japanese made it known to their civilian population and their soldiers that if you get captured or if you surrender or if you give up, you will be treated this cruelly as well. So there's all these suicides throughout these island invasions, and it's important to note that for reasons we'll get into in a little bit. African Americans were segregated in the war. Even though over 1 million of them will serve, they are segregated in their own units. One unit of note is the Tuskegee Airmen. Japanese Americans will also serve in the war, though not in the Pacific Theater, in the Atlantic Theater. Isn't the Bushido Code? So Roman, you're right. So the Bushido Code is more what the soldiers are following, right? If you guys remember when we talked about it, like the idea that a soldier would get a grenade and like hold it to their chest and keep the pin really close. And then when a Marine would go check on him, he'd pull the pin and blow everybody up, right? But that's for the soldiers. That's like so Bushido plays a role. I can't say it doesn't. You're right. And I should have mentioned that. But on top of that, right, there's a story I think of with these Marines that we're talking about. They're on the bottom of this cliff, and at the top they see this like family of Japanese people. I believe that it's either that or it's the other way around. But they're trying to tell these civilians, right? These are just regular, these aren't soldiers. Hey, like, come with us. Like, we're here to, like, we're not going to hurt you, we'll feed you, whatever, right? Like, come over here, right? Like the whole, hey, Japanese lost. And the civilians are like terrified of these Marines. Terrified. And they have no reason to be terrified of the Marines as far as the Marines know, because the Marines, the Allies don't do the stuff that the Japanese do to their prisoners, right? And the Allies know that. And the civilians like jumped off the cliff rather than be taken by the Marines. And so you're right. Some of that's Bushido, but some of that also is the propaganda, because the Japanese were very cruel to their enemies. And there's proof like that you can find the sources, I believe, that the Japanese government was saying they're going to do that to you too. So it is both. You are right. It is both. So thank you for pointing that out. It is both. I would say I would say that it leans more towards Bushido for a lot of the soldiers. And the civilians, it's a lot of like fear, misguidance. But that is a good point. But again, Japanese Americans fighting for the Allies and for the U.S. specifically will be in the 442nd Infantry. It's one of the most decorated groups in U.S. military history, even to this day. Natives will fight the Navajo Code. We've spent some time about it. It never gets broken, which is important because of that codes get broken all the time. I love that picture of the crow. I think these are crow, putting the war paint on like back in the day. Hispanics were not segregated into their own units, so I can't give you a unit name or distinction, but over 500,000 will serve as well. So a couple points about technology. Radar saves the day in most of these battles. In the Battle of Britain, radar is part of why England wins. In the Battle of Midway, radar is part of why the Americans are able to destroy their carriers without losing. I think they lose one. Sonar helps hunting submarines. Submarines aren't just disappearing. It's not magic anymore. Now we know where to find them. And less significant, but still important, V1 and V2 rockets. Think like cruise missiles. These are like early versions of that the Germans designed. So let's talk about the bombs. UAV inbound, kind of. So the whole point of like the V2 is that it's a self-guided rocket. There's a bunch of arguments for and against dropping these bombs. A big one is that, and I tend to agree with this line of thinking, that if the Allies invade mainland Japan, not only will a lot of American soldiers and service members lose their lives, but the death toll for the Japanese would be like tremendous, right? Due to the stuff we talked about, like the propaganda piece, the Bushido Code, like Roman pointed out, that the Japanese civilians and soldiers have. If they're fighting to the death on these tiny little islands, and I mean, guys, islands that are, the size of the land that the school is on. Like, I'm not kidding. Maybe a little bit bigger. Tiny little islands, guys. And they're fighting to the death, right? To the last person to defend them. A lot of Allied thinkers are saying, who knows how hard, they're going to fight to the mainland. People are legitimately worried of how many Japanese people are going to be left after this is over, if they're fighting to the death. And not all the civilians do that, but some of them do. Right? I can't stress this enough. And more so than any major power fighting in World War II, the Japanese forces will fight to the last man often. There are very few Japanese soldiers captured. And that is being taken into account as well, because it is basically by the time you're done, by the time 44, 45 rolls around, it's just the main home islands of Japan that are left. And MacArthur's ready. MacArthur wants to invade them. He doesn't want to drop the bombs because he wants the glory. MacArthur's that type of guy. But so there's that. The Americans are trying to demonstrate their military might. There's all these pros and cons, right? Should we do it? Should we not do it? Should we do it? Should we not do it? We'll preserve lives. It's going to cost lives. We don't know what these bombs will do. This could lead to worse things later on. The Americans decide to drop the bombs. They dropped 2 on Hiroshima in August 6th, and then a few days later, they drop another one on Nagasaki. Once the second bomb is dropped, the Japanese surrender to Douglas MacArthur on the USS Missouri, thus declaring VJ Day, thus declaring the end of the Second World War. That is it for the combat and the conflict itself. But now we're going to talk about post-war effects. So we got a few minutes. It shouldn't take us too long because there's not a lot of notes here. There's only a few. So all we got to point out is some of these terms, like these war conferences, you don't really need to write them all down. There's very few things you need to get from them, and we're going to get into that right now. So we're going to talk about the consequences of U.S. involvement in the war. It's basically what we're covering today. First key point you do need, this is important. I'll give you a quick minute and a half for it after I read it. The war ravaged condition of Asia and Europe, which they're devastated by war. Asia, Europe, even the Soviet Union's devastated by war to an extent. And the dominant U.S. role in the Allied victory, so actual fighting, as well as the post-war peace settlements, will lead to the United States emerging from the war as the most powerful nation on earth, at least for a time being. There's a whole thing about called the Cold War, where there's these 2 really powerful nations that are, there's tension there, but we'll get into that next unit. But immediately after the war, like in the immediate post-war years, the U.S. is the most powerful nation on earth, at least for a time being. And there's reasons for that, right? The economies and landscapes in Europe are devastated. Same in China, same in Japan. Takes a while. Okay. A couple more seconds, then we're going to move forward. Yeah, it is interesting. It is interesting to say the least. And a big part of why the U.S. comes out as so powerful is just because of that. And again, I can't stress enough the industry, right? Like in the Pacific alone, right? The Japanese lose their 4 carriers in a day. They're able to get 2 more carriers, and they fight in this other battle. That's a pretty big battle that the Japanese get destroyed in. But by that time, where the Japanese are able to build 2 more, the U.S. have like 15. Like, to put it in aircraft carriers, like to put it in perspective, the industry in the United States is crazy. So again, for a lot of these conferences, you don't need to write much down. I'm just kind of pointing out the differences in their setups, right? Casablanca was the first one. Churchill and Roosevelt are there. They established this concept of unconditional surrender. The idea that, hey, we're not going to give Germany, here's a little bit of land, we'll keep some, you keep some. Like, they're not going to come to peace like that. The Axis powers have to give up. That's the only way this ends. In the next one in November of that year, this is when the Allies decide to invade Europe. The Soviets are going to invade from the east. The Allies are going to invade in Operation Overlord from the west. And then you got the Yalta Peace Conference. This one's famous. I'm sure you guys have seen this image before. Free elections in the Soviet Union occupied nations in the east is agreed upon. The German occupation zones are agreed upon, where they're going to split Germany up. And the Soviet Union will attack Japan 3 months after the defeat of Germany if needed. And then the United Nations is kind of born here. So Yalta leads to like the UN, leads to these deals that Stalin says he's going to, agree with, peaceful, not what would be like peaceful elections and things like that. And if you guys know anything about Stalin and you know anything about the Cold War, you know that that is not going to happen. Here's the last wartime conference at Potsdam. If you notice, FDR is gone. He passed away. So is Churchill. Churchill was replaced. He was voted out. The Japanese unconditional surrender or destruction is agreed upon. You need to write this down. I wouldn't worry about this. You get the key point. I would write down the Yalta stuff, and I would write down this one. So what I'll do is I'll go back to Yalta in a second because I just realized I blurted right past it. So Berlin and Germany are split up. The Nuremberg trials are established. What's up? Okay. GSSI, guys. Nuremberg trials are created. The purge of Nazism is established. The recognition of a communist government in Poland is set up. And then in Vietnam, the Da Nang partition is also set up. Again, we will talk about that in a bit. I'll tell them hi for you in a bit. Guys, so let me go to Yalta. I'll give you a quick 45 seconds. All you really need to know is that the UN comes out and the Soviet Union agrees to allow elections in their occupied territories. And again, what's important about that Soviet Union thing is they're not going to do it. They're totally not going to do it. It's going to lead to all this stuff, or all these things are the seeds of the Cold War. The UN is established as well after Yalta. I'll give you a quick 25 seconds, and then we'll move on. We'll start talking about the Potsdam. I always want to say Potsdam, even though it's Potsdam. That's just a cool picture. I don't know, FDR, Churchill, Stalin. He's the only one that doesn't look like he looks like he doesn't want to be there. He's like the proto Bernie meme. I don't know. All right, let's talk about Potsdam. I'll give you another quick 45 seconds. Poland becomes communist. Nuremberg trials are going to take place. And the Nuremberg trials are the war crime trials, by the way, where a lot of these Axis leaders are put on trial for their horrible, horrible acts that we'll talk about in a bit. A lot of these atrocities. About 20 seconds. All right, let's go and move forward. You don't need to write anything for here. Just 70 million deaths will be attributed to the Second World War. 45 million civilian, the rest military. There will be numerous genocides and war crimes committed, including the Holocaust, Final Solution, the Nanking Massacre, which we talked about in China, the Bataan Death March, which was done to American soldiers in the Philippines. The U.S. itself will suffer 400,000 casualties, and they will spend around $341 billion, which in today is $4.5 trillion, which is a whole lot of money. So again, you didn't need to write anything for that. Let's move on. The Holocaust. I'll give you a quick 2 minutes on here when I am done. It is brief. The Holocaust, the mass genocide of European Jews. You guys know this already. Just quick rundown if you don't. Death camps, concentration camps. Nazis practiced cruel forms of ethnic cleansing and experiments. Gas chambers. As the war went on, the Holocaust got worse, right? And you guys know this. Early on, they're using these people for experiments. They're using them for labor. They're doing all. But as the war goes on and Germany loses more and more, they quickly become these death camps. Gas them, gas them, gas them, gas them. And it's just, it very clearly becomes just an attempt at eliminating the Jewish people. It's an ethnic cleansing. And it was always that, mind you, that was always the plan. But because Germany starts losing, they start making it go quicker. Not that it wasn't going to happen. Don't think that just because Germany was losing the war, it was going to happen regardless. It just happens to be, it just coincides with the fact that they're losing the war. They start doing it faster. The next slide, I got some images of American GIs liberating some of these camps, some of the aftermath stuff. I'll give you another quick minute on here, though, for the info. Just really quickly define the Holocaust. You don't need to put all these words in. You don't need to get that specific, but make sure you know what it is. About a quick 40 seconds, then we're done. We're almost done, guys. We'll move on in a bit. Almost done. All right. Sorry. Let's go ahead and move forward. Yeah, so these are some pretty famous images. The top one isn't liberating, but these are liberations of these camps. The one story that I always like, it's always point. I'm sure you've heard it before. When the American soldiers and GIs find these camps, their initial instinct is to feed these people, right? Give them the food that they have, the water, all that stuff. And doctors had to like hold them back and say like, no, you can't do that. Because they were starved for so long that their stomachs would shrink, right? And the idea would be that if you let them eat whatever they wanted, they would hurt themselves, like their stomachs could burst and it would be devastating and they would die. And so a lot of the vets that write about these are very frustrated in a lot of their writings and a lot of their journals and letters home, where they talk about how they're in the presence of starving people and they can't feed them, right? Because they have to let the doctors control how that happens. And of course, like the image on the top right, the atrocities are nearly endless, and it's shocking to a lot of these Americans what's happening here. No, I can't stress enough, right? Like when we learn about this now, the Holocaust is there. Like when we started talking about the war pre-Snow, you guys all knew that the Holocaust was a thing. Nobody knew it was happening during that time period until Allies would show up to these camps, and most of the time they were empty, and there's some Germans hiding in there and stuff, but they would show up to these camps and then they would see this, and they're learning it for the first time. Does that make sense? Like the impact it had on people is just different. It hits on a different level because no one knew this was going on. This was a hidden secret. The people in Europe knew, but like the Allies didn't know. None of the Allies knew. So it's really, truly a devastating fact to uncover for them. And as they found out, the world soon found out, and it's horrible. Last thing, legacy. A couple of things to write in. The GI Bill allowed living allowances, tuition fees, and supported veterans in that regard. It opens up the doors to college to a lot of people and comfortable like living expenses, because they get out of the war and they get this GI Bill, they get this money that they wouldn't have had before, this access to college that they wouldn't have had before, that either them or their children would use. The United Nations is formed, which is still around today. It is a more successful version of the League of Nations. And the only two superpowers remaining, the only two major significant powers left that aren't devastated by war, are the United States and the Soviet Union. And they will very, very soon lead into the Cold War, capitalism versus communism, individualism versus collective society, All of those things we talked about during those peace conferences are going to lead to this Cold War. We'll talk about the Cold War next unit. Tomorrow we will talk about reviewing and what we're going to do for our exam. But that is it. So I'll give you a quick minute on here, and then we'll talk about the exit ticket. All right. Getting ready to move forward. Let's talk about the exit ticket. So in Google Classroom, this is already posted. Some multiple choice questions, a couple of open-ended ones. All you got to do for this exit ticket, guys, use your notes. I want you to use your notes for this one. I really do. I want you to see what we can do. And all you got to do is answer them by the time it is due. You have 15 minutes. I'm giving you that long because it's a little longer than normal. It's like 8 questions. And I want you to make sure that you complete it on time and ready. It's all about the war stuff.